All right, we'll get started. Before we get started, do we have any prayer requests? I know we need to remember Miss Hill. She's in surgery this morning for a leg, I think a broken leg. Do we have any others? All right. Need to be sure to remember our pastors, our church. I believe we're going to have Brother Anthony Phillips today on the live stream from France. So we definitely need to remember his ministry and these other missionaries that we are supporting around the globe. So I'll open us up with a word of prayer. Dear Lord God, just thank you for this time to come and study your word, to worship you. Lord, I just pray for your help today as we study your word. I pray that we'll hide your word in our heart. Lord, I just ask that you be with our pastors, be with our church. Lord, as we serve you, I pray for those in our community, Lord, who are hurting. And as our church just tries to minister in this dark world we live in, Lord, I just thank you for the promise that we have in your word. Forgive us where we fail you. In your name I pray. Amen. All right, I will admit I was not prepared to teach today, but I do have a decent idea of our lesson. I did read through it, so the lesson may be a little shorter than normal because I don't have any notes. I'm definitely going to be... might need some input, Gene. I may need you to ask some questions. But that'll be fine. It's a very good lesson. We're in Exodus, of course. And what we've been talking about, of course, in Exodus is the entire chapter, or the entire book of Exodus is pretty much about the children of Israel leaving Egypt, then we go into of course, they get in the law and things like that. But they're in the desert. They're wandering in the desert, relying on God's provisions. Really, if you think about it, we're no different. We're wandering in this world, relying on God's provisions. And if you think you're any better than that, if you think anything you have, whether it be money, whether it be anything, inheritance is going to get you through, it can all be taken with one swipe of the stock market. What happens? Everything you saved, everything you worked for to retire is gone. So anytime that we think we're any different from Israel, we're wandering through the wilderness, relying on God's provisions, we're only deceiving ourselves. So we're going to start off, like I said, bear with me because I don't have any notes. We're going to start off reading, and it's Exodus 17, verse 2 through 7. It says, "Wherefore the people did chide with Moses and said, Give us water that we may drink. And Moses said unto them, Why chide with me? Wherefore do you tempt the Lord? And the people thirsted there for water, and people murmured against Moses and said, Wherefore is that thou hast brought us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? And Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, What shall I do unto this people? They be almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go on before the people, and take with thee of the elders of Israel, and thy rod wherewith thou smitest the river. Take thine hand and go. Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock of Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, and the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because the chiding of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, Is the Lord among us or not? So you see it starts off here with complaining people. Now imagine you could ask most pastors and they would feel like Moses pretty much weekly. Complaining people. Now here they had a legitimate complaint. What is the most critical element for human life? It's not food, actually. It's water. You can go far longer without food than water. And here the people, they were out of water. Now keep in mind, they went into the desert. So, they probably carried some water with them when they left, but they didn't carry enough to go for weeks, months, years. So here it is, they came to some water, but the water was bitter. It was a bad spring. It was not a spring good for drinking. So here they come against Moses. They actually brought almost like a charge against him. You brought us out here to die. And how much sense does that make? Keep in mind, they just crossed the Red Sea. They saw the Red Sea part, and I've never seen it. I saw Mark Farr fall in the water once, and he parted the water, but it was not dry land. You couldn't cross on it. But just think about it. The Red Sea had parted. The entire Egyptian army had been wiped out, and here we're just barely removed from that, and they say, well, we're out here to die. If they would have been out there to die, he would have let the Egyptians get them. But how quickly we forget. How quickly we forget also when God does things in our life and then the next week something bad happens And then well, God's forgot. Where's God? Well, he was the same place he was last week. Maybe it's us who's walked away from God. Maybe it's God didn't walk away from us. It's us. So here they're thirsty. And the people thirsted and they murmured. They complained. They whined. They moaned. And, and even to the point where they said, our cattle, you brought us out here to die. And Moses cried unto the Lord, what shall I do that the people be ready to stone him? So they done gotten pretty wound up. I mean, Moses here was in that point of, they're gonna kill me because they think I brought them out here to die. Now, the funny part is, was that going to do them any good? Where was that going to get them when they stoned Moses? Then they didn't even have a leader no more. They just going to be one. Then they would have died. So you think about it. But they were so mad at Moses, they talking about stoning him. So Moses here was getting a little bit antsy. Lord, they're going to kill me here. I need a little help. I'm sure, like I said, our pastors feel that way sometimes. Lord, they're going to run me off here. I need your help. So, and then it said that and the Lord told Moses what to do. Go before the people, take the elders, not three, but the elders of Israel, and thy rod. Now, that rod was very important. If you think back, the rod is what he held up when they parted the Red Sea. The rod was always with him when he went up against Pharaoh. So he take the rod and the elders and go to this certain place and smite the rock, and out will come water. That's a miracle. That's what that is. That's God's miracle, but God was providing for the people. And notice also God wanted the elders, and I believe because he wanted witnesses. Keep in mind, nothing in the biblical days, it took witnesses. They didn't have the phone. They couldn't take the pictures like we do and get it put on Facebook. They always had a couple witnesses. So he took the elders as a witness for, hey, there wasn't water here, and Moses tapped the rock like he said he would, and there was water. That's God. He didn't go find water. He went and God provided water through a miracle. So he went to this place, and of course he provided the water. But think about it. And he called the name of the place Massa because of the chiding of children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord. Now that's kind of important. It says the children of Israel tempted the Lord. What's one of the 10 Commandments we later on get? Don't tempt the Lord thy God. What does he mean by tempted the Lord? Basically, the children of Israel kind of went against God because Moses, keep in mind, this was not Moses' plan in life. I think he was perfectly happy many years ago in the wilderness with his father-in-law, I think it was father-in-law Jethro's herd. That's what he was doing, minding his own business, and then God came to him. So keep in mind, he was purely a figure piece, a mouthpiece for God. This was not his plan for his life. He fled Egypt. So when they went against Moses, who were they really going against? God. When a pastor, and I'm going to use a lot of references because if you study Moses, you can really relate to the church body and how they react towards a pastor in a church, in a flock. So you think about it. If a God's man's in a church preaching his word, and the church, the people murmur against him, who are they really going against? They're going against God. They're tempting the Lord their God. I mean, you really think about that. If the pastor is in God's will, Moses, we all know, Moses was in God's will in everything he was doing. God was telling him every move to make. So they were going against God, not against Moses. It's easy for us to think, well, I'm against that man or that person. But oftentimes we need to look a little deeper and realize we may be going against God, because if it's God's will and that person, whether it's a pastor, whether it's a Sunday school teacher, or just an average everyday member, if they're doing something in God's will and you go against that, you're not going against that person. You're going against God. You're tempting the Lord your God. And I think that's important for us to remember. We get caught up sometimes in thinking, well, I'm against Gene or I'm against Teresa, but if they're in God's will, I'm against God. And that's a little bigger consequence if you really think about it. So now they've got water, like I said, and then you'll see all through here, children of Israel, they just complained. They were a complaining people. Not like Baptists. We're not a complaining people. The Israelites, they were complaining people. We're always happy. Jonathan's laughing back there. So the next verses we'll read in chapter 17 is verses 8 through 13. It says, Then came Amalek and fought with Israel in that Rephidim. And Moses said unto Joshua, Choose us out men and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the rod of God in mine hand. So Joshua did as Moses had said unto him, and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed, And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy. And they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon, and Aaron and Hur stayed up his hand, the one on one side and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until going down the sun. And Joshua discomforted Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Now we see they got the water. Now, you know, when they left Egypt, they did not leave with a great army. They left with a great multitude, but not a great army. They were not soldiers in Egypt. They were slaves. They didn't have the best of the best when it come to swords and chariots. I mean, that's what Pharaoh had. They were pretty much, they had staffs. That was most of their, they probably had some small weaponry, but they wasn't set up to go fight in another nation at this point. But the nation Amalek, when they were going, keep in mind, just like now, if you go into another country as a big, huge group, people get on edge. So Amalek came out against them, possibly because they were fearful, thinking they were going to be taken. But Amalek came against them. And now keep in mind that also they were not set up for a great war. But Moses said unto Joshua, choose us out men to go fight. Now, like I said, they were not set up for a great war, but God had a plan, and God's plan is He gave Moses, and they chose these men to go fight. But the most important part about it here is, where does it say, I will stand on top of the hill with the rod of God in mine hand. There was that rod again. But notice he says the rod of God in his hand. So Joshua took the men out, and I can kind of imagine, they were probably in some great valley. Moses and Aaron and Hur went up on top of the mountain so they could watch the whole battle. That was pretty common back then for the people, for a lot of the leaders to get up at a high vantage point and actually watch the battle. But when Moses' hands were, when he held up his hand with that rod, Israel prevailed. So you ever watch the old battles? They were just going hand in hand, combat. And when Moses had that rod held up with his hands, it was very obvious Israel was winning. But if you ever stand and just try to hold something, I've done electrical work a lot of times, and you try to hang a ceiling fan and your arms will give out before you get done the first time. They will just be so weak that you can't stand it. Well, keep in mind, Moses, he's standing there with his rod. I believe he was standing with that rod above his head. And he knew it was important because men's lives are at stake when that rod's up. But I don't care how important it is, at some point you'll see that start to settle, and you start to settle. And when his hands were down, it was obvious that they were losing. That's pretty neat there. When God's hands are up, we're winning. But so when Moses would get tired, and then Aaron and Hur started realizing, hey, then when Moses would see him start to lose, he'd push that back up. And then as time would go on, it'd wear down, it'd wear down, it'd wear down. And you think, well, if there's people's lives at stake, I could stand there a pretty good while, but I imagine most of us couldn't stand here much more than through this class period with our hands above our head, holding even a light rod. Well, hands are going to get heavy. And Aaron and Hur started realizing, hey, every time Moses has his hands up, they're winning. Every time them hands go down, we start losing. We got to help him. So what did it say they did? They said they took stones and put under him, and he sat there, and Aaron and Hur stayed his hands up. So that's where I kind of picture that. I think one time Pulley may have preached a message similar to that. So I think you can picture one on one side, one on the other. Now there's that, that is so true about what we need to be as Christians for fellow church members, whether it be the pastors, whether it be someone hurting. We need to be that. We need to be willing to put our arms up. When their hands get heavy, that's when it's our time to lift them up. We should sense that. We should be close enough with our fellow church members to realize, man, their arms are heavy. They can't hold up anymore. That's when we should be like Aaron and Hur. Instead of being like the ones coming against, we should be ready to put our hands under and lift up and steady our fellow church members. Exhort. That's what we're supposed to do. We're called to do that. And this is probably the best example of lifting up, helping lift up someone, is when you look at the study Moses and how Aaron and Hur lifted up to hold up. And keep in mind, all of Israel's men fighting relied on that. If nobody would have helped Moses, and I believe his hands would have just went heavy, they would have lost. And when you lose a battle, men die. Many men die. But when those hands were held up with those close friends. He took those men with him. They were close, confidant friends, and they helped him. They lifted him up. They sensed that, hey, we got to help him. What can we do to lift him up? And when he did that, they won, and the battle was won. And if you study on, and we'll read that they won this battle. And if you really get to studying all the battles, because it wasn't too long after this, I believe they went to a battle, and they didn't, or it was later on, but they went to a battle, and they thought, hey, this one's going to be easy. No need to holler at God on this one. We got this one. We got these people outnumbered, and they got whooped. Every battle that Israel wins, as you'll see when they're going to the promised land, God had a purpose, a plan, whether it was the walls of Jericho, however they went about it, they had to do it God's way. And God's way sometimes was, looked more normal, and sometimes God's way looked totally, just off. This battle looked pretty normal, but if you study about Jericho, there was nothing about that we would have even thought, that's not going to work. But when it's God's way and it's God's will, God will see it through. God has a plan, and He gives those plans to people, whether it be a person trying to lead an outreach ministry, whether it be a preacher trying to preach a sermon series. God's plan He gives to people. He doesn't keep it hidden to everyone. If He kept it hidden to everyone, it wouldn't be a plan. A plan has to be given. Moses was always close enough to God, and just like we should be in the Spirit, to know what God's will is. The will for your life may be to teach, to drive a van, to help on the Shire Committee, to help feed families who've lost. That may be God's plan, but you have to find that plan. Like Moses had to pray to God and find out how God wanted him to proceed, just like pastors pray to God, what do you want me to preach on? Miss Melody, what are we going to sing this morning? God gives you that. God gives you what you need. He gives you that plan like He always gave Moses. But we have to be, first off, willing to listen. And then on top of that, as fellow church members, we need to realize, man, God gave them that plan. They're in God's will. I'm going to trust them. I'm going to help them. I'm not going to tear them down. That may not be what God gave me, but it's still my job to support that person if they're in God's will. God didn't He told Moses to go on top of the mountain to hold the rod up. That was what He gave Moses. But they realized, hey, I'm going to help Moses. That's God's will. So often, other people have plans and God gives them ministries, and instead of just being an Aaron and a Hur, we're about like Amalek. We try to tear them down because we don't like it. It don't fit into what I want. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't want to do that. Well, that's fine, but guess what? Sometimes you need to be willing to get on one side and one of you on the other and hold somebody up, whether it be somebody teaching, preaching, anything we do. We got a huge church body. I think we talked on business meeting, like 680 members. But far often, we can't even get enough people to teach. And then the ones that do try to teach and serve and minister, instead of people lifting them up like Aaron and Hur, they hang on their arms and pull them down. So now you're trying to lift up your own arms and about hanging 3 or 4 people off each side. Quit tearing people down and be like Aaron and Hur and push up. And that's what we should do, just like they did Moses. They saw the need. They saw Moses being God's will. And they wasn't the one that God gave the plan to, but they said, you know what? He's serving God, and he's in God's will, and that's God's plan, and I'm going to lift him up. And that's what we should do as church members as well. So I appreciate everyone. I'm sorry I didn't have everything wrote down, but luckily I studied my lesson this morning, so I had enough I thought we could do something good. So I appreciate everyone and look forward to pastoring this morning.